Hello, welcome to a series of vlogs focusing on speculative fiction. With me today is John Sayle and Sean Hutchings. We're talking today about alternate histories and alternate worlds and how they are created as far as writing is concerned. So, guys, what do we mean by what do we mean by alternate history even?
Essentially, if you want to spin a sub-creation that is based within our own world but with radical changes, alternate history steps in and alters a minor or major point in our timeline, and then the writer will chart the ripple effect.
Sure.
And find a way of spinning a tale from that.
Okay, so
that's the shorthand version.
We kind of call that divergence point.
That's a divergence
so
point.
It's a what-if question?
Yeah.
Is that fair to say?
What if the Nazis won the war? What if Carthage won the Second Punic War? What
Sure.
if, etc.
Yeah. Okay, so is there a big difference, would you say, then, between an alternate history and an alternate world? Is there any difference distinguishable?
If we're talking about alternate worlds in the sense of TV programs such as Sliders, for example, I
Yep.
would argue not. What you're essentially talking about is a science fiction show in which you visit parallel realities, parallel Earths.
Sure.
Each of those tends to have an alternate history
Yeah.
with a divergence point. So really it's only in the scientific conceit of being able to have people from our own history visit these alternate histories, whereas something like a Harry Turtledove novel or Romanitas by Sophia McDougall would actually have the principal characters from that particular timeline.
I mean, Sliders is an interesting one, though, because you've got this idea there are many parallel or alternate worlds, but you have always this concept of almost Earth Prime, or the primary branch
it's
of history.
A baseline Earth
Yeah.
is what we can talk about it as.
Is there any merit then, do you think, in saying that our own, what if a writer was to say our own history is actually an alternate history? We are not Earth Prime, for example.
From another perspective, that would be absolutely true. There might be an alternate group of Sliders with their own
Yeah.
device
There is
traveling to
a
different worlds.
wonderful alternate history novel, and I'm a terrible human being because I cannot remember either what it is called or who it is by, but it's...
Well, if you remember later, we'll put it in the comments section below.
From the point of view of the characters in this novel, the baseline Earth, the Earth Prime, the Spanish Armada successfully invaded England, and later the entire British Isles. It is only in the relative present that an experiment results in time travel.
Right.
And by removing one totally fictional, from our point of view, Spanish general, does the whole thing fall apart, or admiral rather, does the whole thing fall apart and create our history. So it's an inverted alternate history that creates ours. And it's a very, very interesting idea. And if you just Google those keywords, hopefully you can find what the damn thing was called. And if you can, please tell me, because I really enjoyed it.
It wasn't real Britannia, was it?
No, that's a Harry Turtledove one, which is also very, very good, but it removes the time travel aspect.
Okay. So, thinking about, going back a bit to divergence points, or to that what-if question, what kind of issues do we as writers come across when we ask that what-if question? How much do we have to think about around that? Because looking myself, and I know from my own writing, there are a lot of questions you have to ask. After you've asked that what-if, you then enter this whole mess of problems.
The initial question is the easiest part of it. I mean, again, because this is where we come into the murky recesses of feasible and infeasible or fantastic divergence points. So you can say something like, what if the Nazis won the war? A good few days worth of historical inquiry, and you can find 5 or 6 different ways on how to do that. But if, again, like Harry Turtledove, you just say, well, what if aliens invaded at that time? Or with Guns of the South, what if African time travellers from the 21st century travel back to the American Civil War and provide the Confederacy with AK-47s? You have to do a lot more work on that respect. The trouble with the infeasible divergence point is, if you are cunning enough and clever enough a writer, you can get away with it. Because an historian can pick apart a feasible divergence point. But if you start throwing in things like magic, aliens, time travel, it's very difficult to, because your disbelief is suspended so very high, it's slowly turning blue the further you get into the novel. So infeasible ones are a bit sticky in that respect.
I don't think that's entirely fair. I mean, I agree that you will get a historian who can pick things apart. I think that's true in either case. And I think that readers of speculative fiction generally are quite adept at suspending their disbelief. So in the case of striking the balance, etc., yes, you're asking the reader to accept that aliens invade the Earth in the middle of the Second World War. That's a big ask. But no more so than it is to believe that Rome never fell.
Yes.
You can argue these things one way or another, but at the end of the day, your reader, as a rule, is willing to suspend disbelief. What you then have to do is make sure that you don't provide anything to stretch that suspension of disbelief any further.
Yeah. I mean, this is the trouble with the divergence point. It is very much like charting the ripples on a... I mean, as I've said before on this topic, because people have been spending the better part of a year to get me to shut up on it, and now I've got an outlet. It is very much the ripple effect. You change one thing, and then it spirals outwards, and the further you get from it, the bigger the changes. Day one of an alternate history is dull, as is day two. They're not that different. I mean, the example I use is, what if Gavrilo Princip missed and didn't shoot Archduke Franz Ferdinand? It is almost certain that the First World War, in some way or another, would have started with the political climate at the time. It would have had a catalyst, but in what form? But the next day, all the newspapers are saying is that there is an attempted assassination rather than a successful one. In many ways, you could say the same thing about JFK. So the further you get away from your divergence point, the harder it gets. And I would argue there comes a point when historical inquiry fails you because you have altered it so badly. The threads have come apart, and then you stumble into the more obvious conceit of a parallel world.
But you see, that raises an interesting point. Immediately, as soon as you said JFK, and for my shame, my mind immediately went to Red Dwarf and their episode. You know, okay, hang on, JFK. We made Lee Harvey Oswald. We made him miss. We pushed him out the window, and he went splat. How do we fix this? Oh, we'll go and get JFK from the future and make him shoot himself. It'll drive the conspiracy theorists balmy. But you also have a certain leeway in, if you've got a big enough suspension of disbelief, you can play with comedy, you can play... Absolutely. It doesn't just have to be a straight, okay, what if the Nazis won Second World War? What if...
There's a very funny Noel Coward play called Peace in Our Time, which is based purely in a East End of London pub during the Nazi occupation. It's the only one of his plays that is hardly ever staged because it's got a cast of 30. And it's the largest cast of any of Noel Coward's plays, and it's hardly ever performed, but it is a wonderful piece of alternate social history, which is an aspect that's not really examined that often.
Fair enough. Looking then, if you were to write a parallel world or an alternate history, where would you start with planning, do you think? Because you can ask that what-if question, but as we've said, there are quite a few ripples that we've got to think of now. We've got this what-if question. So let's say, for example, there was a torpedo narrowly missed a boat which was carrying one of King George's sons during the First World War. What if... Oh no, sorry, it was actually during the Second World War. Yeah, I can't... For the life of me, I can't remember who. It was the basis of one of the projects I was working on.
Yeah.
Was it Battle of Jutland?
I think it might have been.
Because the future King George VI would have been involved in that.
He was serving as a naval officer. There was a torpedo hit the ship he was on, but it never sunk. Now, what if that ship did sink, for example? All of a sudden, you've got no clear successor to the throne. You've got no alternative to force an abdication of a king. All of a sudden, we've got this huge massive questions that comes from that. What if the George that we're speaking of...
Well, you end up with Queen Wallis Simpson, in short.
Exactly.
And no government, because Stanley Baldwin famously said, yes, you can marry her, but I'm taking the government away.
But when we're planning something like that,
we've got no small thing.
No, we've all of a sudden got to think of loads of... So where would you start if you were going, okay, this is my what-if question, this is my divergence point, where do I go from here?
Oh, sorry, John.
No, not at all.
Is to immediately remove what can't happen. To examine the immediate successor of that event and remove the things that, the events that occurred purely because this happened the way it did. Once you remove what can't happen, you then have to examine what might have done, what was the second in the running. Because for the first 5 years, 10 years maybe of your sub-creation, the gaps very much fill in themselves. You don't have to do that. If you're willing to put in the legwork and the historical inquiry yourself, the vacuum will fill itself, and all you've got to do is keep the pieces together. It's after about, in my experience anyway, it's around about after the 20-year mark that you have to start really getting cunning. I mean, there's some things that sit in history and warp time that can't be avoided, but like the Titanic going towards its iceberg, it's an inevitable collision, but they will never happen the same way again. So how I would start is to immediately strip away what is negated by your divergence point.
So just to pick up on the idea of the Titanic may never sink in the same way, if we have a divergence point well earlier, is that then to say maybe the Titanic wasn't built by White Star Line?
Potentially, the Titanic may actually not be built at all, depending on what's been changed in the timeline.
Or you can avoid the strike that led to the White Star Line cutting corners on the quality of iron that built the ship. So
it's still going to hit the iceberg.
It's crippled in the middle of the ocean, but the Carpathia can turn up, or maybe it simply sinks. Maybe it does take 4 hours to sink rather than 2, and there is time. So all these little things change history massively. And what I would suggest is that you don't do what everyone is very tempted to do. Because alternate history really makes you want to go to something that in A-level history you're taught not to do, which is the concept of great man history. Do not leap into that head first. Events create men, cometh the hour, cometh the man. It is not the other way around. I was very lucky in my sub-creation because quite a lot of the recognisable political figures were kept on a only marginally diverted course and could end up where they were. But you can't indulge in great man history purely because, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a blasé example here.
Well, I must confess I disagree to some degree. It is a temptation. The temptation, I would argue, must be considered before it's either accepted or discarded. There are circumstances in which great man alternate history can be well worth looking at.
Oh, absolutely.
Admiral Sir Thomas Cochrane, for example, at one point hatched a plot to rescue Napoleon from exile and spirit him away to Latin America. The notion of Napoleon alive and loose in Latin America, that's a wonderful thing to play with from an alternate history point of view.
I just think it shouldn't be it must not be the first port of call.
Well, no, I wouldn't. Not unless that in itself is the historical conceit in question that you wish to examine. I would also argue that it's not always the case that you have to let your alternate history percolate for 20 years. It depends entirely on the extremity of the event. So going back to JFK is wounded. November the 25th looks very much in that alternate history to the November 25th in ours. Housewives are still making their food on the same machinery, people are still going to work, etc. On the other hand, S.M. Stirling wrote an alternate history called the Peshawar Lancers. Now that was set some time after its divergence point. Basically, during Disraeli's premiership, there is a asteroid event which batters the northern hemisphere. He lets that percolate for a century, but he could actually start writing the day it happens, because things immediately look substantially different.
It's almost you've plunged the world into an apocalypse, effectively.
Precisely.
But then you can play with things like anachronistic technology. There's
Sure.
a wonderful novel called Queen Victoria's Bomb, which essentially gives away the plot in the title. Essentially, in the 1840s, a British chemist discovers uranium. Or rather, it's been a very long time since I read it, I do apologise. The long story short is that the Victorian British use a nuclear device in the Crimean War to bring it to an end.
Okay.
And so here's the largest empire on earth at the time, certainly the most politically powerful, with what even now we consider to be the most devastating weapon known to man. And it was a very interesting point. It was summed up essentially in a sentence. It was that minor a detail. But when you start looking at the social history of an alternate history, and that's where it gets very tricky, wondering who the everyday man is now and how that changes. Just as a very brief point, in the history of the British Empire, there's a very definite change from when it becomes essentially a very big-headed missionary enterprise, where they went into India, they brought cricket, they brought democracy, and they wanted to essentially, and this is a quote, they said they wanted to create brown Englishmen. There's a very definite shift when it becomes of racial suppression. And that's when Queen Victoria gets her bomb. When Cecil Rhodes starts as the great imperialist thinker. So it was at that moment in social history that the empire got its weapon, and that is a terrifying conceit, and it was a very, very minor detail.
Okay, thinking then about these divergence points, these alternate worlds, and the amount of planning sometimes you have to put in, or you can choose not to. What if, as can be presented often on TV shows, for example, being the best example, 10 sci-fi TV shows, you get the crew of a starship plunged into a parallel world or an alternate world, and the writer doesn't explain what the divergence point is. It's just an alternate world where this is the norm. So let's take something very simple as civilization was a matriarchal society rather than a patriarchal society. But it's never explained at what point that came about, at what point there was a divergence point. Does the writer still need to know that? Is it important for the audience, though? John?
I find, frankly, that sort of thing to be quite lightweight and therefore uninteresting. People who are interested in alternate history tend to be interested in history.
Yeah.
If you're talking about, for instance, the crew of the Starship Enterprise, then fair enough, the audience may accept that, in which case the writer doesn't necessarily need to know.
Yeah.
The audience doesn't necessarily need to know. But I would compare that to popping into McDonald's for a burger rather than sitting down to a really good, well-made meal.
Yeah.
It's not as satisfying, in my opinion.
But does that mean then that you can't do... what if you had, for example, the writer goes, they know that they've got this episode, not necessarily Star Trek, but whatever TV show they happen to be writing for. They've got this episode, they've created an alternate world, they've worked out what the divergence point is and the ripple effects, but they never explain it to us, the audience. Do you think that's going to show within their writing?
Yes. If it's done well, yes.
I find it, I smell the old rule of show, don't tell, and I find it peculiar that cinema and television, that is fundamentally a visual medium, a medium about showing, does alternate history so very, very badly. It was a radio series rather than a television one. It was a Doctor Who radio series. And the idea was, here are these creatures who change history, and so they can feed on the time energy. Yeah. What is time energy? Einstein is really bothered by the idea. And one episode was Pete Davidson's Doctor. He finds himself on a German U-boat in the First World War. You are left to discover the minor details. You find out that it is the U-20. You hear through conversations with the captain that he spies a Cunarder through the periscope. And then the Doctor contrives it that, to get the TARDIS back, he makes the captain, captain of U-20, turn it around before he sinks the ship. Now, he doesn't say, oh, there is the Lusitania, quickly let us sink it. It's very calm, it's very much how it would be. You've got the charts as 4 funnels, could be a Cunarder, and everyone's like, oh. And it's very, very understated, and it was beautifully done. So by the end of the episode, you're left thinking, well, what happens if the Lusitania doesn't sink? And then they spoil it entirely in the concluding episode, where they spend 5 minutes with one character telling you what happened, not discovering the world that happened. The idea being that there was a petty criminal on board who would have died, became a violent burglar, and killed Alexander Fleming in a botched burglary. And so Earth is wiped. Most of the population of the planet is wiped out by an outbreak of meningitis in the 1860s. That is a fantastic conceit. Wasted. Put us in that world. You convinced me totally that you had him, the time traveller, on the U-20, and you convinced the captain not to sink this unnamed Cunard vessel. And then to spoil it entirely is a wasted opportunity. So it's very difficult in drama to do.
Well, you say about TV and film doing it so poorly. Then I'll ask you the question, what about Sliders, which was the example we came to quite early on. Sliders is built almost entirely on this premise, that you have an Earth Prime and you have the ability to travel to all these different alternate worlds which have at some point had a divergence with Earth Prime or our history as we understand it. That is actually quite, I would say if I was thinking alternate worlds, alternate histories, that's the first place I come to almost immediately with TV. Would you say that there's been an issue with that, or is that...
I've never seen it.
Fair enough.
Though I get this hideous feeling that with everything we've just discussed, that there will be a moment in that episode that is a solid 5 minutes of a character saying, this is why this world is different from ours. Please tell me I'm wrong.
Off the top of my head, I honestly can't, because it's been a couple of years since I watched it. But I think there probably is, yeah. Or at least there's... right, so it's that made it different, or some. I would guess, yeah.
Is this the one with John Rhys Davis? I think I've seen it advertised
in the early
channel,
seasons, yeah.
I can't comment on that.
I mean, the thing is, it's common not just to alternate history, but to an awful lot of speculative fiction. Consider Blade Runner, one of the great classics of science fiction. We have a opening explanation of how the world has changed. That is telling. I recently saw a short science fiction film called The Gift that was maybe 5 minutes long, and in the first 40 seconds you see hover tanks in Red Square, a soldier having his identification checked, you see a robot butler, and nothing is explained. There is no dialogue initially, but it's setting out its stall. This is the world you have come to. And it doesn't need an explanation. It doesn't need anyone to tell, because it shows. You know roughly where that is, when it is, what's going on, what the political system is like, how the social order has changed. Alternate history can do that. And if you create an alternate history without explaining the historical conceit, but you have done it properly, so you have worked out what your divergence point is, you have worked out what the effects of that are. You have extrapolated from those effects to get to the world that you set your story in. The great thing is that world has an internal consistency and cohesiveness, which then shows up on the page or on the screen. We may not know why the world is like this, but it is convincingly like this. And I think that works beautifully.
One of the minor examples that did it very well on the same, back to alternate history, did you see any of Sky Art's Playhouse Presents?
Yes,
Did you see Snodgrass?
The very first series, I don't know whether I saw
They
it.
did one called Snodgrass, and it's in total silence, starts off outside this tenement house in 1991. And it's Ian Hart playing John Lennon. And he's in the bathroom, absolute squalor, vest, shaving, he's 50-odd, puts on his glasses, and Ian Hart looks an awful lot like John Lennon when he's got his own. Goes downstairs, there's a Beatles song playing on the radio, and he just slams it off and sits down. That's the start of the play. And the alternate history is that John Lennon left the Beatles before they became famous. But in those 3.5 minutes maybe, the entire scenario was set up, and the only bit of information that the writer has given you is the date. And that's it, he's just given you 1991. The rest, straight off like that, you can piece it together. The rest is total exposition, but the start is absolutely marvelous.
So, I mean, when it comes to books, novels, etc. I mean, obviously, film and TV is a very different thing. You have some people argue that you have less time in order to establish things and less time to explore things. Is that perhaps a reason then why maybe novels and similar formats are better for exploring an alternate history or an alternate world?
I would argue not. I mean, it occurs to me that one thing with the cinematic medium is you don't have as much time to tell your story, but on the other hand, you can use visuals.
So an establishing shot of this is the world. So to pluck an example, a recent Doctor Who episodes, for example, where they have dirigibles, Zeppelins above London. You know, that is
my God, man, that was 2006. Where have you been?
It's fairly recent, you know what I mean. Doctor Who's been going on for the odd years.
Yes, go on.
But, you know, that's a big establishing shot, which immediately tells you are in
a different
another
world.
place, yeah.
Yes. I think it makes an enormous difference. I mean, alternate history, speculative fiction in general, you can do an awful lot simply with a visual, with a soundtrack for that matter.
Sure.
So I really don't see that it does make that much difference. You have more time to explore it on the page. You can explore it in more depth perhaps on the page. You can go into more detail if you so wish. But I don't think it necessarily gives you an advantage when it comes to expositing your world.
That's a fair point.
It seems to be this tendency when it comes to these sub-creations that your character will always be somebody who explores the world around them. There's always a detective of some description. A favourite one of mine, by Harry Turtledove and Richard Dreyfuss of all people, called The Two Georges, in which the American Revolutionary War was settled amicably. And they're based in the middle 70s, I think, where there is a painting called The Two Georges, which is the stripes of the American flag with a Union Jack instead. And this is the symbol of a very special relationship. Anyway, it's stolen by American nationalists. Lo and behold, here is a detective character to hunt it down and get all the little nuances of this world, to lay it out bare for you. Now, here's a question to you two. Is this a bad thing?
Not necessarily, depending entirely on your story.
I think it'd be difficult to have... it'd be more difficult, I would imagine, to set up that alternate world if you don't have somebody exploring it. If you just have person A living in this alternate world and going about their daily lives, you could eke out small things, but it's going to take you longer, or it's going to take the reader longer to get to this point of, so we're not in...
I disagree. It depends entirely on the world and the story and, for that matter, the character. Their daily life might be sufficiently different. Sophia McDougall's primary characters in an alternate history where Rome never fell are the nephew of the emperor who stands to inherit the throne and a pair of escaped slaves in the 21st century. That is immediately a very different world, and you don't need a detective.
So maybe then it depends on the subtlety of the changes. If it's more subtle changes, perhaps
more subtle changes, perhaps, but on the other hand, alternate history, generally speaking, isn't about exploring subtle changes. It may be exploring the consequence of what were subtle changes, but those consequences are really subtle in themselves.
Fair enough.
One way of doing that I find very exciting and is becoming, has been steadily becoming more popular amongst alternate history writers since the middle 80s maybe. It started with a book called A Different Flesh, which was the question of Native Americans, or the ancestors of, did not travel into North America, but Homo erectus did. And it's done as a series of connected short stories lined chronologically that explore different facets of this world episodically. Some of them feature historical characters. There's part of the Roanoke colony, or the lost colony of North America. There's a part that is purely Samuel Pepys's diaries, and then the abolition of slavery, because why should humans enslave each other when there's this other thing that works just as well? And that kind of episodic style of having individual stories in different time periods
Well,
I thought it was a very interesting idea.
Not too recently, not associated with the vlog, we had this conversation about what, if you have something other than human, which is an interesting, it's an interesting thought.
I know, that's why I brought it up.
Surprise, surprise.
I haven't read it, I found it last night and thought, I'm going to get Martin with it.
Fair enough. Let me get you with something then.
Okay.
It occurs to me, we talked briefly a second ago about what if you have daily life and routine. 1984, is that an alternate history? Because I'm thinking
now.
Specifically, well, not necessarily that. I'm thinking specifically when they tried to adapt it for theatre. There was a production recently at the Playhouse here in Liverpool, which included the appendices and the notes and what have you, which framed it as you had these characters at the very beginning at the book club exploring this book, and then at the end you don't quite know whether or not this is... There is
somebody
an argument
reading Orwell's 1984 or a history class.
There is kind of an argument
that
that actually... It was very well done. I don't know whether either of you saw
No,
that
I tried, that's why I
but
just couldn't have the time.
it was a fantastic production. It got me thinking, well, actually, could you consider it as alternate history?
I would ask the question, does it actually engage a historical conceit from before the time that it was written? If it does, then it is alternate history. If it doesn't...
I think on this argument, Huxley's Brave New World is probably a damn sight better. It was written in 35, it was published in 35, I think, give or take, and he talks about the War of 1939. He talks about a 9-year war that ends atomically and creates the conditions for the world that Brave New World investigates. So in that conceit, I'd say
Yes.
Brave New World
Is certainly
it has become an alternate history now, yeah.
Fair enough. I think we've reached a natural stopping point there, so we'll wrap it up. Next time we're going to be looking at, post-apocalyptic fiction.
Oh, lovely.
So please stick along for that. Thank you for watching if you have been. John Sayle, Sean Hutchings, thank you. If you liked the video and you want to see more, or any of the videos on the channel, please consider giving the subscribe button a click. Well, please click the subscribe button on the video. And join us again next time. Thank you very much for watching. Bye for now.